Thanks for downloading this episode from Teachers Talk Radio. You can find the full schedule and listen back to all our shows at ttradio.org. Enjoy the podcast.
Hello and welcome to the very first Sunday Social. It's me, Martin Sketchley, and today we have Dylan who's joining us for our very first episode. So welcome.
Thank you, Martin. Really nice to be here and best of luck with your first show.
Thank you very much. Right. Well, let me just introduce Dylan first of all. Dylan has been working in the ELT world for nearly 30 years. He was born just outside of London and he now lives in the south of Spain, where he works as a freelance business English trainer, teacher educator and course creator, and his previous jobs include being a director of studies, EAP lecturer, examiner and materials writer. He holds a Delta and an MA in applied linguistics and ELT, and is an advocate for deep-end approaches like Dogme or Teaching Unplugged, task-based language teaching, and the power of dialogic learning. He's currently training for a half marathon, so good luck, and annoys his neighbours by playing 80s pop songs on his ukulele. And if you want to connect with him, you can find him on LinkedIn. And no, I didn't memorize that. I printed that all out. But yeah, welcome. Thank you ever so much for joining today, Dylan.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Okay.
Looking forward to it.
Perhaps we could just get started. Our overall topic today for the Sunday Social is about Dogme ELT or Teaching Unplugged. And perhaps we could roll it back a little bit. Maybe you could tell me a bit more about your background. You mentioned, or in your bio that I read, you've been teaching for nearly 30 years now. So congratulations. Could you tell me a bit more about how you got into teaching?
Yeah, sure. So I think my journey is pretty typical of a lot of people, certainly Brits, in that I finished university in the mid-90s, didn't really know what I was going to do. I had a degree in humanities, so I majored mainly in English literature, history, psychology. And a friend of mine had a French girlfriend and he wanted to move to France to be with her. And so he said he was going to take this CELTA course at a place called International House in London. And we started talking and I thought, I was really wanting to go traveling at that point. And I thought this would be a way to finance my traveling or extend my trip so I could actually work while I was out there, wherever I was going to go. And so I worked for a little bit, got the money together, got myself on a Trinity TESOL course, which was quite unusual because it was like, I think it was an 8 or 9 week course, which actually was great because I didn't feel that intense pressure, that boot camp feeling that people had. And did that. And automatically, from the first moment, I thought, I quite like doing this. I felt very comfortable teaching. And then I ended up finding work in London at some very dodgy language schools, to be honest. A couple of them were very, very dodgy indeed. And but I enjoyed the teaching. I really enjoyed meeting people, mainly adults, although I did a bit of summer school teaching. And I loved it, being in that multicultural environment and working with people from different countries. And then ended up going to Spain for a while, doing a bit of teaching. Spent time in Latin America as well. Again, I did some teaching out there, did a bit of business English teaching. And then I went back to the UK and thought, what next? So I ended up working in a really good school. The director was Dr. Jason Anderson, who was, I guess, one of the first people who I thought, this guy seems to know what he's doing. He's really passionate about language learning and second language acquisition. And that kind of inspired me a little bit. And then I ended up staying at the school, got myself a Delta, was made assistant director of studies, later director of studies, and then did an MA and got into teacher training and then sort of EAP. And these opportunities, once you get the qualifications and you've got a bit of experience, you come across these opportunities, and I was able to take them. And but living here in Spain, my options are slightly limited because I don't live in a particularly big city. I live in Granada, and I realized that I sort of wanted to do my own thing a little bit more. So I started working on a more freelance basis, and yeah, here I am many years later, still in the business and still in.
Yeah, so I suppose it's a similar path that many people take, going into teaching. And for me personally, I ended up teaching in South Korea without any qualifications, just a bachelor's to my name, and then enjoyed it so much. So I went into the CELTA course, and I suppose the rest is history, as they say. Okay, well, obviously our topic is Teaching Unplugged and Dogme ELT. Could you tell us a bit more about what is Dogme ELT?
Yeah, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. I did a course with Scott Thornbury, and I'm not sure he knew how to pronounce it either. But originally it comes from a Danish film movement. I was I'm still a big film fan, but this was in the 90s, I think. And the idea was that these Danish filmmakers felt there was too much brought from outside into the filmmaking process, whether that were special effects or whatever, soundtrack. And so they decided to adopt a back to basics approach. And I think Scott Thornbury, if I remember rightly, he saw a Dogme film, and then he thought, this kind of applies to how he felt about teaching as well. And this would have been, I guess, in the 90s, and CD-ROMs were coming in, and with course books and videos, and I think it was this back to basics approach where perhaps all you really need to actually teach a language and learn a language is people talking together, and the language that emerges will provide opportunities for scaffolding and interaction. And in terms of topics, people have things to talk about based on their own life, their own hopes, experiences, and everything like that. And so I think Dogme sort of started from that. And again, perhaps teaching at some point we relied too much on the tech and not enough on the interactivity between people and the social element of learning and teaching. And then I think Scott Thornbury and Luke Meddings, they standardized that in a book, Teaching Unplugged, which actually I have here. Definitely recommend.
Oh, yes. I've got my book. It's not on my immediate bookshelf, but probably somewhere else. Yeah.
I pulled it off the bookshelf just for this interview, actually. But the idea is there are three key principles. One, effective teaching, conversation driven. Materials light, because materials, I wouldn't say they get in the way of learning, but I think you don't often need so many materials in the classroom, because a lot of the content of the classroom can come from the interaction between the learners and the teacher, and between the learners themselves. And the third point is focusing on emergent language. So it's very much what people talk about in adult language teaching. You start with where the learners are at. So you start with that learner language. What can they produce? What can they understand? And then you build from there. And so those three principles, conversation driven, although Thornbury's now changed that to text driven. So that also allows for kind of maybe an idea of a writing Dogme class as well. It doesn't only have to be verbal conversation. So yeah, conversational, text-driven, materials light, and focus on emergent language. And that leaves a lot of space in the language learning environment for real communication, for real interactivity, and for the learners to have a voice that's not brought in from outside. And I think a lot of people, after a while, a lot of teachers realize that's how they enjoy teaching, and they feel engaged teaching like that.
And I suppose for some teachers, they unknowingly end up teaching in that style, I suppose, because the focus is on developing that rapport with the students, and that language, the emergent language, scaffolding language, and for that interaction to take place between the learner and the teacher. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. And as you said, I think that's a natural progression for a lot of teachers, and they feel that that kind of suits their approach to language teaching.
Mm. Now, I'm not sure if you're aware, but for my MA, I was first introduced to Teaching Unplugged when I was taking my MA at the University of Sussex, and the book, I think, was published around 2010, 2011. I'm not entirely sure.
2009, actually, it says here, but yeah,
2009, okay.
but it probably came out in 2010.
And I was first introduced to the book whilst I was doing my MA, and I ended up doing my thesis, my dissertation, based on Dogme ELT, and I was very curious, and that led me into the world of Dogme ELT, or Teaching Unplugged, and I was very grateful to have volunteered during the International IETFL conference in Brighton at that year as a volunteer and just a chaperone helping people around. And I met Scott Thornbury and Luke Meddins, and I've got my book signed by them, which is great. And I was very passionate about this approach to teaching, and during my research and talking to other teachers, I discovered that actually, although these teachers probably didn't have a particular name to apply to this approach that they were undertaking in their classrooms, they were pursuing it, or they found this approach the most suitable and the most beneficial for them and the learners as well.
Yeah, and that reflects my experience, I think. As I said, I was working at a language school in central London, and I remember, I think it was either I was ADOS or DOS, but the boss of the school, like lots of bosses of language schools, or the owner of the school, said the teachers were spending too much money on photocopying. You know, they were walking into their lessons, with a bundle of handouts, under their arms. And so I was asked to produce some materials light lesson plans, so just outlines of conversational based lessons. And I think now what I was basically doing was somehow a combination between task-based language teaching and Dogme, but they were very minimalist. And I remember really enjoying that, and I got very good feedback from the teachers. And then years later, I came across the Unplugged book, and I thought, it's kind of what I was doing all along. Just having basically pretty simple lesson plans based around the idea of you set something up, you let it run, and then you round it off, which is basically the Dogma lesson plan structure.
Yes. Okay, well, is there anything memorable? Do you have a memorable experience of pursuing a Dogme style lesson at all?
Yeah, this is something I wrote recently, actually. There's a book which has just come out, Dogma in Practice, or Dogma in Practice, and it's available now on Amazon, and I think you can buy it as an ebook and also as a paper copy. But when I was teacher training, a while ago, I remember that I think I'd mentioned the approach to a few learners, a few of the teacher trainers, and they seemed very interested. And one of the trainee teachers was supposed to teach. So you've got all these learners waiting for this class taught by a trainee teacher. And then she texted me to say that she was dropping out of the course. And so I had to step in. I asked the trainee teachers, would anyone like to give a lesson off the cuff? None of them did. So I thought, okay, I've got 3 minutes or something. And I remembered that someone had talked about Star Wars in a previous session. And so I think I just printed out a photo of Yoda, put it on the screen. And then we started talking about the idea of mentors and coaches and everything like that. And so the class just developed from that. And it was all about talking about important people in your life who had an influence on you. Didn't have to be a teacher, could be a parent or a friend or an older brother or whatever. But that was an example of how I was able to build that class. And then I got the students to write questions to each other and have conversations. And, the hour went by and they loved the class. All this emergent language came up. They were really engaged because they were talking about something that was personally related to them. They could share their experience. They practiced telling anecdotes. I was able to work a little bit on language. But, that was an example of how it is possible to create a lesson spontaneously or with just a minute or two's thought. And it worked very well. And the trainee teachers really enjoyed seeing that. They enjoyed, and also I let them work with the students. So they also got practice dealing with the language that was coming from the students and doing a bit of emergent language work. And so that was an example of something that worked very well. And it really made me think, it's such a shame on many initial teacher training course, there's not the time to have these kind of very free, conversation-driven classes where the trainees can learn how to deal with emergent language on these courses. It's very much about planning and following your plan. And as we know, in the majority of cases, either the plan won't be finished or you'll go off topic at certain points.
Hi secondary school teachers, we're Apps for Good, and we give schools like yours free introductory computing courses. Our courses are for everyone, including those who aren't computing teachers, and they're fully equipped with resources mapped to the UK computing curriculums. Independent learning is central to our courses. Your students will develop essential and digital skills by working in teams to create prototype apps. We'll even connect you with industry volunteers to give real-world feedback. Let's empower every young person you teach to shape their future with technology. Speak to us at www.appsforgood.org.
Did you know that every year, half of disadvantaged children who are top attainers at primary school don't go on to achieve top GCSE maths results? At Axiom Maths, we exist to change that. Our fully funded program helps schools nurture young mathematicians through weekly face-to-face maths circles, where pupils tackle challenging and exciting problems outside the national curriculum. With just under £3,000 annual funding, expert training and quality resources, we give schools everything they need to inspire the next generation of mathematical thinkers. Want to make a difference? Visit axiommaths.com today and join over 400 schools delivering maths circles across the UK.
Meet 2025 BET Award winner Kialo EDU, the 100% free tool for thoughtful, inclusive classroom discussion. On Kialo, students contribute instantly and simultaneously to create an interactive map of a discussion, deepening their subject knowledge and enhancing their critical thinking skills. Set tasks, track participation, and provide personalized feedback in just a few clicks. And since it's compatible with all your favorite LMS platforms, it slots seamlessly into your existing workflow. Over 1 million educators and students are already using Kialo to make the world a more thoughtful place. Join them today at kialo-edu.com.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Yes. Right. Well, I'm just going to segue into our sponsor for today. This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com, John Catt, cat being with a double T, to explore the full range of titles. And there's a code. You can use the code JCTTR, all uppercase, JCTTR2425 for 20% off your next order. Okay. Right. Well, it's an interesting point that you were mentioning. I suppose one thing that there's two things that stick out in my mind. One pre-Dogme ELT, maybe around 2006 or 7 during my CELTA course, and then one around 2013, 14 when I was in the UK teaching young learners. And the first case for me was I remember my final teaching practice I had to undertake for my CELTA course. And I was commuting from a city, it was kind of a small village back then in Ansong. And in Korea, we had the very slow train. So I was getting up at 5 a.m, getting the train about 6, getting into Seoul around 8, and then running around the corner to the British Council, getting ready to teach my final teaching practice at 9 a.m. And the trains are very, very reliable in Korea. And for this being my final teaching practice, the trains were delayed. So, not delayed, but there was something that happened on the track. So I was stuck on the train for a bit. I got into Seoul Station. I ran to the subway, the underground, I suppose, for our American listeners. And I got to the center, and I was sweating, and I rushed into the classroom with about 5 minutes to spare, and I was up first. And I said to the students who were sitting there, I said, I'm really sorry, my train was delayed, and I'm just trying to get everything ready, and please wait for me, and please be patient whilst I get everything sorted and organized, and we'll start the lesson. But how did everybody get on arriving here? And my trainer back then, she came up to me, and she was a bit of a stickler to begin with, but my final lesson, she said, I really like the fact that you were really honest with the students, and they could connect with the difficulties you were encountering on the train, which was quite nice to hear, because it's not always about delivering the plan or always sticking to how things are expected. Now, the final point that I was mentioning post Dogme, or post introduction of Dogme ELT to me, was I guess it was in the mid 2010s or so, 2013, 2014. And I had a group of Colombian young learners who, a monolingual class, probably about 16 students in the classroom. And they were all talking about, I think it was about a place that they went to visit over the weekend as part of their group. And they ended up just wanting to talk and talk and talk. And I used a board marker, and I was writing up all the words that they were coming up with. I had my photocopies, a stack of photocopies ready to go, but I never touched it. And my 50 minutes class, I just put everything up on the board, scaffolded everything, gave them new phrases, more natural language, collocations, and all that sort of thing. And the kids loved it, and they went to their group leader, and their group leader came back to me, and just saying they really liked the fact that they were able just to talk and not study, I guess, in a traditional sense.
Yeah. And I think that's a great little story, because, as you said, studying in the traditional sense obviously has its place. We're always restricted by our particular context and what people expect from language learning and what other stakeholders expect. But if we can find room for those spontaneous moments where real communication takes place, then I think most learners, in my experience, value that as well. They see the benefit, even like you said, young learners. And I've had, with very few exceptions, people have always, I think, been quite receptive to that idea of, okay, we're going to just spend the next 5-10 minutes doing something a bit more spontaneous and just letting the language flow a little bit more.
Right. Well, I've got a comment here, actually, from Chris Fry, and he says, How many students did you usually have in the classes where you were teaching using a Dogme approach? And for me, with the Colombian young learners, it was about 16. Adult classes, I think, was restricted to 12 students in a class. EAP classes are obviously a bit larger, but how about your experience, Dylan?
Very similar, very similar. No more than 20, I think, again, with EAP classes. And I've had Dogme moments or Dogme style activities in EAP classes, maximum of 20. In typical language schools, certainly in the UK where I worked, it was, generally about a maximum of 20.
Yeah. Would you think that it gets to a point where Dogme can't be applied? Because in my context in Korea, sometimes some of my classes is as large as maybe 60 students. What would be your recommendation or a cutoff point when it comes down to students?
Yeah, honestly, I've never taught more than probably 40 at a go. So I'm not sure what it would be like teaching 60, but I imagine that as long as you can structure it, can't you? So you have groups working simultaneously. So obviously there are more demands on the teacher there, but you can nominate a group leader for each one. And I don't think it needs to be that different to working with 20 people in a group. Where you have to, you might have 5 groups of 4, and so you're moving from one group to another, monitoring, and that's whether it's online or offline. Obviously, when you go from breakout room to breakout room, it's the same. So as long as you can do a bit of monitoring, then you can hopefully help the learners with any emergent language issues that come up.
Yes. Now, if there are teachers listening here and they are curious about applying a Dogme approach to their classes or to their teaching, what recommendations would you have for those particular teachers?
Well, I think I'd be very surprised if teachers haven't had Dogma moments in their classes, like you said, with your situation where you arrive late and you spent 5 or 10 minutes talking about transport or how people got to the school. And I think most teachers naturally have those moments, and it could be just when you're waiting for the learners to arrive, and so you start chatting with one, and then there are 3 students, and then there are 5 students, and you're still maintaining that conversation. So I think it comes very naturally to us. Most of us will have had that situation where we've had spontaneous communication. So you can lean into that a little bit more by thinking, okay, well, I'm going to have this spontaneous communication and see if I can deal with any emergent language things that comes up. What kind of language do the learners produce? How can I deal with that if they make any mistakes, or if they use some good language which could be shared with the rest of the group? So I think that's something that people can do and probably do. Most teachers probably already do it, I think, in most situations. And then I think, obviously in the PPP model, you've got the production stage. So, presentation where you present the language point, whether it's a grammar, structure, or vocab items. And then you move into the practice, the control practice, then the freer practice or production stage, in which learners are expected to use that target language. Well, one little experiment you can do is you start with the production stage. So if you've got a course book which has basically a PPP structure, just start with the production stage, see how that goes. And then you might find that the students are using the target language naturally, and that will enable you to consider, well, perhaps I don't need to spend so much time on the presentation or the practice. So that's a little experiment I think people can just try. Obviously, you want to take baby steps at the beginning, but perhaps just try with starting with a production. You can always repeat it at the end, and hopefully they'll be able to perform better.
Yes. So like flipping it on its head.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Now, I suppose for some teachers, having the physical handouts or the bundle of worksheets under their arm can act more as a comfort for them, can't it? And I think for me personally, when it came down to deciding, okay, I'm going to go and with a materials light approach, I made a concerted effort not to print out or not to photocopy so many, and get in and not relying upon third party worksheets and that sort of thing, and then focusing more on the learners. How would you encourage teachers and educators to apply that? How would you wean them off that comfort?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. I mean, I think again, it's a question of doing it slowly for many teachers, and then getting feedback from the learners as well. See if the learners can buy into that. Because in my experience, a lot of learners, if they are using a course book or if they're following worksheets, they're not necessarily the biggest fans of either. Even if the worksheets are good, a lot of learners will generally enjoy being given the opportunity to move away and to do something a bit more spontaneous. So there's also the buy-in from the learners as well. And so again, I think you can just experiment. I think it's all about experimentation, doing little experiments in your class, extending things if possible. But
yes,
a lot of it comes down to planning. And I think there is, in psychology, they talk about the planning bias, the planning fallacy, which is that things generally take a lot longer than planned. And you see that in all walks of life. When a government decide to, I don't know, build a new library, they say it's going to take, well, probably not, that's a bad example, libraries are being destroyed in general. Let's say they plan to build a new hospital and they say it's going to take 6 months and it takes 2 years. And I think in a way, lessons are a bit like that. In my experience on training courses, the teachers will plan, let's say, an hour lesson, and either they'll rush through it and they'll be obsessed with finishing their plan, which means they don't cover basically what's needed in sufficient depth, or there are moments where the learners have to move, they're pushed forward in the plan when they're not quite ready. That happens a lot. And so I think we've got to accept that we generally don't get through our plan. It's, and the planning fallacy seems to be something in psychology that applies to so many different fields. And I'm sure it applies to teaching and education as well. And so we start with that premise that we probably tend to try to do too much in a plan. And if we can accept that and think, okay, well, I'm going to try to do a little less and leave some breathing space. And we always talk about recycling and reviewing and language. And so we can just, even if things do go as planned and we have 10, 15 minutes at the end, well, then we just have a recycling slot, which is always valuable in language learning. And so, if we have a 60-minute lesson, well, plan for 45, see what happens. You've always got that 50 minutes and say, it's just a recycling slot, recycle whatever it is, some previous grammar or vocabulary, if that's how you've been doing it in the past few months. So I would say that just experiment with planning less.
Well, it kind of reminds me of one of my advanced practical teaching courses during my MA. It's like equivalent to the diploma, not the same as the Delta, but my final teaching practice was a Dogme-esque style lesson. I decided, right, I was introduced to the book. I thought, I'm going to apply this into my teaching practice as an experimental form. And I had to write a lesson plan, which sounds a bit strange for a Dogme lesson, because the whole premise, the whole philosophy for Teaching Unplugged or a Dogme lesson is you follow what the learners bring into the classroom, and or you go with the flow. And I thought, well, actually, yes, I could plan for the different eventualities of what could happen, what might happen. But then I realized actually, well, reflecting on what had happened in the classroom compared to what I planned is certainly a great way to view it, to view that process. And my teacher trainer came to see me, and he said, well, I'm not entirely sure how a lesson plan could be written for a Dogme style lesson. And I said, yes, I agree. But perhaps maybe the best way forward would be to write a lesson plan post lesson for a Dogme style lesson.
Yeah, and this idea of retrospective planning, I think it's really important. And certainly it's something I've practiced in the past. And I think that's a different way of looking at one of the advantages of this approach, is that it's quite similar to task-based language approach, in that you get them doing something, you find out what the weak points are or what they need or any gaps, and then afterwards you can actually fill in those gaps and then get them to repeat the activity again. But by doing retrospective planning, I think that's what it's called, then you can identify these gaps, and then that can feed forward into your next lesson. And again, you don't always have to be spontaneous, but you can engineer your next lesson so that's covered a little bit, and again see what happens. But again, I think the idea of feedback alongside feed forward is really important here. We have to do both as teachers, I think, to make sure our lessons are responsive as well as being preemptive.
Now, I'm going to touch on the subject of maybe the drawbacks or the challenges that individuals may encounter when trying or attempting this approach, this philosophy of teaching. What is your overall view with regards to the drawbacks of Teaching Unplugged Dogme ELT?
I mean, one of the drawbacks definitely is that a lot of these lessons do turn into conversation free-for-alls. So, I mean, that's sometimes what learners want. Certainly in my case, I work with a lot of adult learners, and what they want is the ability to speak about most topics with a certain level of comfort and confidence. So I think it can work all right with these type of learners, but many of our learners aren't like that. And certainly some learners will be trying to improve their English to pass an exam, which is obviously, I don't know what percentage of learners are actually focused on that, but I imagine it's very high in certain places. And that's definitely a drawback. And you end up just becoming a conversational partner. So I think one thing you can do is you don't have to take 100% Dogme approach. It doesn't have to be so binary. You can say, okay, I'm going to have these Dogme moments, or it's going to be one of the different approaches or strategies I use in my lesson. So I think that's one way we can mitigate that problem of these Dogme style lessons turning into conversation free-for-alls. I mean, the other issue is that most teachers are probably bound, or they're restricted, or they're expected to follow a syllabus. And again, I think what happens is that you move away from a linguistic focus syllabus, and you think most syllabuses now syllabi are based around, you have topics, a list of topics, and a list of language points. Wait, okay, you continue with the topics and see what happens. Do the language points come up naturally? Maybe not in the order of the course book, but often I think you find when you do this approach over a long period of time, these grammar points are covered anyway.
Yes.
So I think that often helps. So I think there are the drawbacks of the approach. I think I'm not sure how serious they are in a lot of contexts. And I think you can still arrive at the same destination with this approach.
Yes. I do like the idea that you thought of with when it came down to a number of different strategies for your teaching,
Mm.
and having this philosophy, this approach, however you wish to call it,
Mm-hmm.
being one of many different approaches that are available and can be called upon when it's necessary. And I believe it was a number of years ago when I went to English UK. What was it called? Eclecticism.
Yeah.
I can't remember the particular phrase, and it was used. And my thesis, I called it a balanced approach. So sometimes you can go into a Dogme approach. Sometimes you may go out of it, depending on where you are in that particular lesson, in that course, and that side of things. But having that flexibility to go in and out of that would certainly help.
Yeah, I
But
think
that,
it's principled eclecticism, isn't it? The idea is
that's
that
it.
actually you think about, okay, at this point, this is maybe what's needed. And I'm certainly not going to say the PPP method is always to be avoided. It can be very effective, maybe with some specific. We don't know enough, really. Maybe with some specific grammar points, it does work really, really well, and that actually being more explicit and teaching it in an explicit way works much better than being more implicit. But maybe not across the board.
Yes. And then obviously the biggest thing that's happened post-COVID is online education and online training, online education, teaching English. Where do you see Dogme going when it comes down to online education?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it, how there has been a renewed interest in Dogma in the last 4 or 5 years, basically post-pandemic or during the pandemic and since then. And you wonder why that is. And I was thinking about this the other day, actually, because it also appeared basically around the time of the economic crisis of 2008. So I don't know if there's something in the air at certain points where people resist or reject a certain sort of socio-political movement. But it is interesting. And it might be that what we're doing now, we're in different continents, we're able to communicate online, but we spend so much time now online that people actually need that connection. And the approach offers people the chance to actually interact more than in a lot of other traditional language classrooms. Also, nowadays, I mean, it was called the flipped classroom a few years ago, but with the online, the change to online teaching, the flipped classroom is the most natural thing in the world now. You know, why would you need to actually teach an explicit grammar point to a group of learners in a virtual classroom when they could do a lot of that, certainly the controlled practice stuff, in their own time by themselves using apps? So,
of course. Yeah. Now, it's interesting. One of my fellow teachers that I used to work with in the UK, she called Dogme ELT jungle path teaching, which was very nice.
Yeah.
Getting off the beaten track, I suppose. And,
Yes.
And following that sense. And have you heard of other names or phrases that have lent itself towards Dogme ELT as well?
Okay. Well, there was what was it now? Someone described it as winging it elevated to an art form, which I quite liked as well. I thought, okay, and there is a certain element of truth to that, I think. And also, I think it does relate to a lot of other movements like coaching and Dogme. In fact, I've just had a conversation with someone on LinkedIn about that. And actually, coaching and Dogma, they share quite a lot in common. What are the differences? It's probably easier if you're working with professionals to sell the whole idea of language coaching. And whenever I've dabbled in language coaching, I've thought, actually, there are a lot of similarities there. But yeah, I think it's a movement. I'm not sure its time has come. I think there'll always be a certain preference for more traditional approaches. But I think a lot of people are definitely seeing the value in this approach, either as the main approach or as a supplementary approach, or one of certain approaches, as we talked about a couple of minutes ago with the idea of principled eclecticism, that we look at our context and we think, okay, what would be suitable in this context?
Hi, secondary school teachers. We're Apps for Good, and we give schools like yours free introductory computing courses. Our courses are for everyone, including those who aren't computing teachers, and they're fully equipped with resources mapped to the UK computing curriculums. Independent learning is central to our courses. Your students will develop essential and digital skills by working in teams to create prototype apps. We'll even connect you with industry volunteers to give real-world feedback. Let's empower every young person you teach to shape their future with technology. Speak to us at www.appsforgood.org.
Did you know that every year, half of disadvantaged children who are top attainers at primary school don't go on to achieve top GCSE maths results? At Axiom Maths, we exist to change that. Our fully funded programme helps schools nurture young mathematicians through weekly face-to-face maths circles, where pupils tackle challenging and exciting problems outside the national curriculum. With just under £3,000 annual funding, expert training and quality resources, we give schools everything they need to inspire the next generation of mathematical thinkers. Want to make a difference? Visit axiommaths.com today and join over 400 schools delivering math circles across the UK.
Meet 2025 BET Award winner Kialo EDU, the 100% free tool for thoughtful, inclusive classroom discussion. On Kialo, students contribute instantly and simultaneously to create an interactive map of a discussion, deepening their subject knowledge and enhancing their critical thinking skills. Set tasks, track participation, and provide personalized feedback in just a few clicks. And since it's compatible with all your favorite LMS platforms, it slots seamlessly into your existing workflow. Over 1 million educators and students are already using Kialo to make the world a more thoughtful place. Join them today at kialo-edu.com.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Yeah. Now, I'm going to go back again just to online teaching briefly. And my experience of online teaching is, as you mentioned, many students have access to grammar practice, listening. The internet has transformed access to a lot for English learners, so they can stream movies, they can watch YouTube videos and everything else. But then when it comes down to the productive side, either spoken, verbal, or written, that's where they tend to seek when it comes down to online teaching. And I've noticed more and more students online tend to want just conversational practice, particularly if you're teaching one-to-one. There's a tendency to follow a dogme style approach, where the student brings up language that they've encountered or questions that they ask about particular grammar points, or they produce some writing and they want to go through the writing with you. And there's certainly a difference compared to in-class teaching, where it's the traditional approach of introducing the grammar, presenting it, and for them to practice and produce it. Whereas online, or the more tech-savvy learners, just want that practice. Yeah.
Yeah, I work with a number of learners on a one-to-one basis, mainly adult professionals. And yeah, a lot of them, that's what they want. They want, okay, I mean, we always discuss how we can move forward with this, and we have a very basic plan, but it could be them choosing a topic. Then the onus is on them to take a bit of accountability. Um, Even something as simple, okay, you watch this video, you read this article, and then you come back to me, you summarize it, and then we'll discuss it. And that seems to be an approach that a lot of adult learners in particular favor. It's also true that I work with a lot of learners who have an intermediate or above, B1, B2, C1, C2. And so the Dogme approach does, I think, align well with that type of learner.
What about the lower levels when it comes down to maybe A1, A2 learners? Do you think a Dogme style approach could be applied for that?
I mean, this is one of the big criticisms, isn't it? And I've certainly done it with lower level learners. And again, it's based on the same principles, is that you start with something quite simple, but they're able to produce output based on that. And then you use that output and just improve it in some way. It's, as you said, it's scaffolding, and we can get them just actually either by the end of that particular session, they might be a little bit more fluent. They might be a little bit more accurate. They may have given another option to actually do something as simple as just, talking about food they like with someone. So, again, I think it can be done with lower level learners. Obviously, you're limited by the amount of output they can produce, but it's still output. Even unless you're working with complete beginners, then, I've had A1 learners who are actually quite good at interacting and conversation around a limited range of topics, but they can do it. And I think as long as people can do that, then you can use the approach with them.
Well, I'm just going to share an experience I had with elementary Japanese students many years ago, because it's kind of reminded me. But before I do, I'm going to segue into our sponsorship for today again. So for final parts. So this show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com, John Catt with double T, to explore their full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off today. Right. Well, when it came down to my Japanese elementary students, we had a particular course book, and they were it was a 2-week course in the UK, and they visited our university, and the students were your atypical Japanese students, quite reticent, quite shy. I think they were all female Japanese students studying to be nurses as well. And I invited them to try and talk about or introduce their hobbies. And one student said to me, I played the violin or piano, but not now. So it meant like I used to. So that was when I was able to introduce that form. I used to play and then we looked at that form, and the lesson just continued in that direction. And that is probably one of those rarities where a student, particularly that level A1, A2, attempts and tries very hard to communicate, knowing they don't have that linguistic ability, that language, that capability just yet. But that experimentation certainly pays off. And I think the students could see it. And hopefully that gave them the confidence. You just need to communicate as well. You don't need to know everything to be able to communicate effectively. You can just make yourself understood, and it certainly helps if you're studying as well.
Yes, yeah, and that's another great example of how your objectives were not necessarily related to that, but there was an affordance there, wasn't there? And you were able to see that as an opportunity for the learner, maybe just to get a little bit of exposure to a language structure, which they probably won't be able to acquire for quite a long time. But maybe later, that at this point, you've introduced it, so they're primed to understand it the next time they come across it. So that can help, these kind of incremental differences. But from a more sort of global, holistic viewpoint, that, as you said, that confidence that she was given in this moment to think, actually, I was able to express this message, not perfectly, but I was able to really express something that I wanted to express using the limited amount of language at my disposal. And I think that's very valuable for learners to realize that quite early on, that, they're still able to communicate despite not being able to communicate perfectly.
Has it ever influenced your approach to learning a language as well? Because for me, the language that I tend to study or be exposed to, of course, is Korean. And it's kind of given me that sense of, I've got to try. I'm going to try and communicate, regardless of whether I know the words or the grammatical structure. I'm just going to try that, and there'll be something I can take away from it at the end of it. Has that really informed your approach to learning a language?
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly when I started learning Spanish, it was a bit like that. I mean, I took classes for a few months, and they were very traditional, actually, for the most part. But yeah, quite early on, and what I realized very early on, it's that I was in a class with some Japanese people and some Dutch people. I would hang out a lot with the Japanese people because I didn't speak Japanese. They didn't speak English. And so we were obliged to speak Spanish. And again, this is something that a lot of people expect. They think, I need to learn from a native speaker or perhaps a proficient speaker. And thankfully, that has changed in the last 15, 20 years. And we're now aware of how much we can learn from our peers. And of course, there are, I wouldn't even use the word dangers with that. There are, it seems to be that theory suggests that, and research suggests that you don't generally pick up on too many bad habits from your peers. It's probably more positive, the effect that peer-to-peer learning will have. So I think that's also something that could be integrated or a benefit at Dogme, because they will have to communicate and interact not only with the teacher, but also with their peers.
Well, I'm going to probably finish off our final part. But before we do you have any questions yourself to me or highlights, I suppose, of our topic today?
Well, I think it's quite interesting that you're in Korea, and I wonder how Korean learners feel about sort of the Dogme approach. Because in my experience, I've taught Koreans, but only in multicultural classrooms, and it was quite difficult sometimes to get them away from the perfectionism and the focus on accuracy.
It's an interesting point for my from my experience. Yes, there's a certain element of perfectionism attempted by Korean students, where they feel a sense that they have to try and produce something perfect, or they try that there's this pursuit for a native level of fluency in English. And there's a particular student that I'm keeping an eye on at the moment. He's what I would call as a typical Korean student, who has this belief that he's studied grammar for many, many years. He's studied vocabulary. He's able to communicate, but he doesn't have that intrinsic confidence that he can actually communicate. And he always comes to see me at the end of our class, and he asks me, how can I improve? How can I get fluent? How can I improve my English? And I kind of remind him that it's not a marathon, although you're training to get involved in a marathon. But I tell him, well, actually, you have to enjoy it. You have to be surrounded by the language and expose yourself to the language, and don't rely on translation, and don't rely on what you don't know to try and give you that sort of feeling that I'm not good enough yet because I don't know X, Y, and Z, or I don't know how to use the grammatical structure here. Just be happy with where you are at the moment. Try and read, and I did ask him, do you read? Meaning, do you read for pleasure? And he said, well, I've been reading this book, and I've highlighted these words I don't understand. And I'm thinking, well, no, but you can just read. You don't need to understand everything. And I think you need to spend just a little bit of time, particularly when it comes down to Dogme or any form of teaching these days, is to just get the learner into the mindset that they don't need to know everything. They just need to be aware of the general meaning of what they're reading. If they can understand the overall meaning, then the emphasis is on that, not what does each individual word mean. And hopefully my particular student will, and I'm confident he'll achieve very, very well.
Yeah, exactly. But it requires that mindset shift, doesn't it, in the learner, where they realize that actually accuracy doesn't necessarily result in fluency. Probably the opposite isn't true either. Fluency won't result in accuracy. And but I think it's very important for learners to realize that this is, as you said, it's an ongoing process, and there are different levels of understanding, which, to be honest, is the same for us as so-called native speakers. I mean, the other day, I can't remember what word it was, but I was surprised when I looked up a word in the dictionary, and I thought, I've kind of misunderstood this for, the last 30 years.
Yes. And I do try and part with the students that I don't know all the words. I don't know every word. I get an idea, a feeling of when to use a particular word and when not to use it. And, I get them to think about their own language, and do they really know each individual word and what it actually means, or are they just using words which are just conceptual, it just comes to their mind? And like you said, changing that mindset it can be a bit of a struggle depending on how deep those habits are, I guess, when it comes down to language learning.
Yeah, and that's why working on things like metacognition in the language classroom, I think, is really, really important. And I mean, I spend a lot of time with adult learners, things like a needs analysis, but exploring people's beliefs, not only about themselves as a learner, but also about language learning in general. And often I found, certainly with adults, you have those conversations and you open up those conversations, just with certain statements. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Now chat with your partner, now form a small group. And often that actually leads them to consider other perspectives. And I think that really helps you as the teacher. I don't think it's necessarily our job to tell them, this is how you're expected to think about the language learning journey. But getting them to reflect on their own thoughts and situation and beliefs, I think, can definitely help.
Yeah. Well, we're going to finish off there. So thank you ever so much for joining our first episode of the Sunday Social. It was a pleasure to have you on, Dylan.
Thank you very much for the invite, Martin. I've really enjoyed it, and best of luck. I hope this will be the first of many successful Sunday. What is it?
The Sunday Social.
The Sunday Social show.
Yes.
Okay. Not easy to say after a few drinks, I imagine.
Yes. Well, coffee for me. And thank you ever so much for joining again. And I hope you are successful with your marathon that you're training towards.
Only a half marathon, but thank you very
Half
much.
marathon.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.